I want to do a couple things today. We got a lot packed in. My goal today is to try and kind of take stock of where we're at. I'm going to move this because it's taller than I am. I want to kind of take stock of where we're at in the semester, and I'll kind of talk you through hopefully how we're getting here, and hopefully see how much we've learned already, or how much we've at least read and hopefully are trying to apply. And then one of the things I'm going to do is I have a couple. I think it's really difficult when, we have people in class. We have some people on Zoom, some people who Zoom in, some who don't, some who are entirely online. I think that's really hard to get a lot of perspectives in the class. It might feel like there's, only certain people talking based on who's represented here. So this week I pulled from a couple response papers just to kind of provoke some conversation. But that, I have to tell you, is also a little bit strange for me, because I think it's weird to talk about words that someone wrote without that person physically represented and being able to talk about them themselves. But we're going to try it and do so hopefully generously and graciously. But I do want to include kind of online people, solely online people. So I brought some of those kind of conversations in. I called today week 6, how do we globalize composition? Or how can globalized identities impact composition? And one of the things I want to think about with you all is, and I love this, I love, how personal you all are being in your response papers, and really kind of thinking through your own positionality as teachers, as scholars, as students, as, parents, various kind of identities. And I think a lot of you have posed this question, but specifically I'm going to point to a couple people who have posed the question, what do we do with this, right? What do we do knowing these issues, knowing about dominant languages, knowing about white language supremacy, knowing about these marginalized identities, standardization and the negative impacts on people. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Taking stock of the semester. I have week 1, we were kind of defining terms. We were talking about what is transnationalism, what is globalization, multilingualism. I think that set up a really good definitional week. I'm going to go back to it. You'll recognize some of the slides today, actually. So really setting the foundation. What are we talking about? Week 2 and 3, we went to language politics. There, I wanted you to kind of understand the connections between language and power. So we read things by John Trimber and Bruce Horner. We talked a little bit about students' rights to their own language. And so this is the idea of that language and power impact how we teach. It impacts the research we do. It impacts how people are kind of addressed in their workspaces. It impacts a lot of things, a lot of institutional factors that we still are all part of, right? Whether you're a student or a teacher, administrator, a coach, all of those things still come into play. Then we moved into identifying global frictions or tensions, really with Anat Singh and Elaine Richardson and Carmen Kennard, recognizing these moments of kind of tension or friction or difficulty within literacy, right? Or within literacy or composition. One of the things I want to remind us all about is that I think it's really easy to see the word global and think whoa, we've been talking a lot of our articles have been about teachers in America, right? But one of the things that Kate Vieira, Morris Young, and Rebecca Lorimer-Leonard talk about when they talk about transnationalism is that an American classroom is often impacted by transnational identities, right? People moving into this classroom. We talked the first day about how all of us came from different locations, how we speak different languages. So even in an American classroom speaking English, there's still that transnational understanding. In some spaces more than others, right? And then last week, we kind of ended with if I can get rid of this, examining how geopolitics impact English, as well as how that impacts language dominance. So they're talking about Suresh Kanagaraja's work, Catherine Prendergast, right, buying into English, Min San Lu's work, talking about people physically cutting their tongues to speak, better English. A lot of our articles last week were really talking about how geopolitics impact that perception of language. So that's kind of what we've done. Here's how I envision what this means, right? The impacts of globalization. If you have globalization in the middle, some of the things that it impacts, and these are really kind of the concepts of the course so far, we have immigration and migration, right? So we've read Jay Dolmage's work, Vincent Portillo's work, Tam Marco's work. We have this idea of language, politics, and policies. Week 2, institutional structures and programs. So like globalization impacting what we do in the classroom, what we do as administrators, as teachers, what tests students take to get into schools. All of that is institutional structures. Globalization, as we learned from Ralph Centrone, affects our methods of research. What do we actually include in our methods? Can going to talk to someone in a town and learning about graffiti constitute research? Can doing an oral history of Mexican farm workers constitute a method of research? The answer is yes to all of those. But globalization impacts what we even view as knowledge, what we view as methods, and what we view as valuable research, right? Transnationalism and translingualism is impacted by globalization, and with that, like multiple languages, as well as dislocation. So like thinking about how people not only migrate, but how they're dislocated at times. This could be kind of physically, or it could even be, I view dislocation as more of a metaphor. When I think of Ellen Cushman's work in the Cherokee syllabary, that's all about dislocation, of someone trying to remove you from an identity, remove you from a place or an identity or a language. Yeah. So those are like the big topics, right? Beyond that, we have these smaller impacts of globalization. So globalization can impact our classroom and research projects. It can impact our funding or lack thereof. It can impact how we do standardized testing, or if we do standardized testing. It can impact daily interactions with classes, right? A lot of, I'll just point out Joyce. I mean, Joyce, last semester when you told us about ice raids, at your school, do you mind sharing?
So we have quite the Hispanic population in high school, and we had, there was, I think it was in Paris. The last year there was 100 something reported, and I had several links that were students. Nobody came to pick them up.
Yeah, absolutely. So just even how those daily interactions can be shaped by this view of globalization, not always a positive view, right? In that way, very negative, impacting the lives of students in really traumatic ways. We're going to talk a little bit today about how globalization can affect journal and book publishing, like actually how the modes of research, like how it gets distributed. Okay. You all are reading these articles because someone chose to publish them. Well, someone chose to write them and someone chose to publish them. Think about how many times someone wanted to write something and it didn't get published, and the various reasons why. Not always really ethical reasons, but you're only able to read what actually someone deems, publishable. Some small group of people, actually. And then we'll talk a little bit today about globalization, how it impacts our writing assignments, or the possibility of writing assignments. Does anyone have anything to say about this, or are you thinking about anything connected to these topics?
I feel like, globalization, I don't think currently it's an issue. There's arguably a pretty a statistical percentage of the country wants to retreat from the word.
Yeah.
And I don't know that that's possible. Like, I kind of feel like it's almost like a boogeyman at this point. It's just a word
Right.
to rail at when
Yeah.
the groundwork for this has been around since at least the 40s.
Mhm.
So it's just, so, and the funding obviously stood up to me because it made me think about it in economic terms, supply chains and how things move around the world.
Yeah.
But then you can't make a direct comparison because then you're calling people things like that. So,
Right.
but funding stood out to me for that because I don't know who approves the kind of grants you might need to do something like this, but if it's the same kind of small people that decide what what gets published, you might have to be careful about what you pitch and who you pitch it to.
Absolutely.
If you want to get money.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things Brian pointed out that's really important is, and I'll even tell you when I was naming this class, well, renaming, someone pointed out that I always rename my classes. Joyce, was that you? Someone pointed it out. I always rename my classes. They have like a subtitle and then a subtitle. Yeah. But so composing in a globalized world, I actually don't necessarily like that title. I'm more or less like composing in a transnational world. But I thought globalization was important because there isn't one. It's not good. It's not bad. It's really complex. We're in a globalized world, absolutely. But there absolutely is people who want to retreat from that and want to say, no, the U.S. is not. We don't have to be accountable to global powers. We don't have to be accountable to a global economy, right? And that's on all levels, on institutional levels, of every hierarchy. So I think there's a problem with the use of globalization. So I'm glad you brought that up. I don't think it's a neutral word. It's just a word, but I think its impacts are not neutral, I guess. Anyone else have something to say about this? Or thoughts? I want to bring us back to week 1. And I posed the question, this is actually the exact same slide, and I said, so what does composing look like in a globalized world? And this was from 4 C's, Statement on Globalization in Writing, Studies, Pedagogy, and Research. And I want to take us back to this moment. It says, globalization is both a worldwide force and an everyday local phenomenon. Movements of people, ideas, goods, services, and capital under both peaceful and conflict-ridden conditions challenge ways of being that have been traditionally tied to discrete nation-states. Such challenges can be especially apparent in educational institutions, which frequently articulate explicit ideas in attracting students with a wider range of cultural and linguistic backgrounds, sending students abroad, preparing graduates to enter a globalizing societies and economies. At the heart of these educational efforts is a conflict. On the one hand, colleges and universities may recognize, respect, and respond to the complexities of globalization by reimagining administration, teaching, and research. On the other hand, they may use the pretext of globalization in a limited fashion to enhance institutional reputations, identify new sources of revenue, and entrench received standards. So in that way, they're talking very simply, it goes back to our very first reading, Deborah Brandt, I think we read, talking about how sponsors of literacy can act in any which way, positively, negatively, both and, either or, it's all of the above. So globalization is shaped by those people in power and how they wield it, right? Sometimes in really good ways and sometimes in really diminishing ways. I won't read this whole thing, but I do want to say the implications of globalization for writing, pedagogy, and research are varied and complex. And one of the things that I think that this statement does, and here's where I got my key terms, by the way. Globalization is tied to questions of immigration, dislocation, transnationalism, and trans or multilingualism. And therefore, the term must be used purposefully, especially at institutions of higher education that are recruiting increased numbers of international students. And then this is how they define globalization. One of the things I want to point you to is they talk about how globalization relates to pedagogies, so how we teach, to research in writing studies, so how people become scholars and what scholarship they do, the types of organizations people are involved in, and then they offer recommendations for researchers, teachers, and writing program administrators, which is what I am. But I would also say that this is useful if you're a department head, if you're just someone interested in this work and wanting to think about how to kind of further think about globalization in your organization, in your school, whatever that place is. These would be good to think about. So what is the way that you're teaching writing, and the curriculum you're using, who's involved with it, so the program leaders and directors, how you involve faculty, how grad programs are shaped by it, how you do research with globalization, your methods, how that research is represented. So like I said, the reason we are reading these texts is because someone decided to represent them. Someone said, yes, let's publish this text by Ralph Cintrone. And I think it's easy to take those as I'm losing my train of thought today. I think it's easy to see a book and think like, wow, people respect this because Ralph Cintrone published. But there's so many choices that are made, and it's so easy for something not to get published. And it's really something, the materiality of that, of like why one book is chosen and so many others aren't, is really significant. And I'll talk to you a little bit later. I do a lot of work in editing and publishing in the field. And so I'm part of making those decisions for some journals, and with the goal of trying to expand it and broaden what's represented. But I think that's something that still needs to be pushed further as a discipline. Yeah.
Do publishers have the type of mission statements that journals do?
Some of them, a lot of them do.
So you know if this was even worth pursuing in this, because I know it doesn't answer all the particular questions.
Yeah.
But if you know for sure your book is going to deal with working class people, and you're pitching it to something that only deals with Ivy League education, like that's probably not a good fit.
Right. So there's an easy answer to that and a really difficult and more complex answer. So the easy answer is yes, they have mission statements. So for instance, I'm marketing my book right now. I know that the University of Pittsburgh Press does like a language, culture, and rhetorics thing that I'm like, oh, I love working class stuff, right? Now, if you take that for something newer in the field, there might not even be an avenue for someone who wants to do Latinx youth rhetoric in the borderlands, right? So some of those structures aren't created yet. So how do you publish a book if the institutional structures don't allow for it yet, right? They might broadly say, okay, we're interested in some of these things, but I think the publishing world still needs to grow quite a bit. I'm going to show you kind of some new initiatives in composition and rhetoric that I think are trying to do that. But overall, I mean, there's still very few publishing companies. So what happens if you don't fit into the few, right? People have to get creative or not be published, which is interesting when your job usually depends on it.
Requires it.
Yeah. So a lot of those are kind of the material constraints of, this work. I'm hoping that as you reread this, it's starting to make more sense now that we've read articles about this, right? Then we went to, in week 1, Rebecca Lorimer-Leonard's, Kate Vieira's, and Morris Young's Introduction to Literacy and Composition Studies, and they posed the question, what does the transnational movement of people mean for literacy? And what does literacy mean for the transnational movement of people? How do you all feel about this term, this concept, transnational? How do you feel about it? Are you grasping it? Do you feel like it's still kind of, it's over there, I get it, I know when to use it, but I'm not really sure what it is?
The way I'm interpreting it is that it's kind of like a third space between where you were starting out and where you're going, and you're like creating this kind of a blend of both, but also neither at the same time.
You just kind of look at it really literally.
Really literally?
Like just say crossing, because I'm doing some work in some of these readings with the sort of arbitrary nature of these lines we draw.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it's literally or with something you produced, like in a book or something, crossing those lines. So that's kind of like a straight up like fake line we drew and things and people crossing it.
Yeah.
Is how I'm looking at it. So it's time to stop me if that's wrong.
So let's take their definition, and I want us to actually apply it to a couple of the readings that we've done. So defining transnational. We understand transnational to be an optic or an analytic that traces how individuals build social fields across real or perceived borders to accommodate and resist difficult circumstances with sustained activities over time and across space. The transnational does not analyze spaces out there beyond borders, but examines how cross-border connections, kinwork, affective ties, long-distance nationalism occur among spaces inclusive of the U.S. So go ahead and think of an article that you can kind of talk us through. Like, how is an article from our class transnational or not? Once you have one, go ahead and shout it out to us.
I think the article that we just read, Angelstown, or rather the book Angelstown, it encompasses this exactly. Because we get to see what it's like in the perspective of these farm workers or Mexican nationals, and the differences between our culture and theirs, and then kind of blending the two together and helping us understand the similarities and how to maybe bring ourselves a little bit closer to the individual and understand what it is that they have to go through. So I read the chapter on, I think it was looking for Don Angel.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that encompasses it exactly, because they start talking about legal documentation and things like that, and then start talking about the language and how the translation of the language and how it doesn't necessarily translate per se, but then kind of explains it. So I think that this transnational definition goes hand in hand with what we read.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought up that chapter, because right in the beginning, they talk about getting your passport, green card, driver's license, and how those documents, those writings define society, right? And then it says, begins on page 51, Mexican immigrants in Angelstown use phrases, I'm going to mess these up, but regular supaples, to fix your papers, or tengo que arreglar mis papeles. I need to put my papers into order, to indicate the complex procedure of making oneself legal in the U.S., including the procedures of becoming a citizen. So quite literally, the blending of Spanish and English in the first sentence, saying how writing happens across those borders in social spaces, examining kind of that movement of people across borders. All of that is tied up in what transnationalism is. And I love that you pointed out the actual translation. If you didn't read this chapter, later in chapter 3, there's these really cool moments where there's Spanish and English translations of the conversations going on, and so you kind of see that transcription and how that's impacting, what knowledges are being pulled out. So yeah, I think that's a great moment.
I thought Cruz Medina's decolonial potential, because of telling the stories from the kids' point of view of traveling all over and rather being put in with sharks than having to speak English in the classroom setting. That was really emotional,
I think you're a week ahead. Send that next week.
Oh yeah, I'm ahead. Sorry. Yes.
I could be wrong. No, but that's great.
I am,
Like,
because
wait,
I wanted to write about that.
Yeah. No, but you're absolutely right. Cruz Medina's work, absolutely transnational. That's a great example.
The Richardson and Raglan piece is not about other countries per se,
Right.
but if we're working with this definition, the social fields of it, an optic.
Remind us what Richardson and Raglan
This
talk about.
is the Black Lives Matter, Stay Woke, the memes, and the borders in this sense is not a national or even a state line. It's in like societal lines.
Yeah.
So it's about the interaction between people of different backgrounds in the same space.
Mm-hmm.
So if we apply parts of this definition, this could work too. It might
Absolutely.
be a little harder to defend.
No, I think you're absolutely right. So one of the ways that, right, they say that it's an optic or an analytic. That gives us kind of leniency, but also like pushes us to like ask, how can a transnational lens on this text teach us something new, or does it teach us something new? One of the things that you made me think about, my good friend Candace Epps Robertson wrote a book last year, and her book was called, and it was written by Pittsburgh, the place that I was talking about, Pittsburgh Press, Resisting, come on. Resisting Brown, Race, Literacy, and Citizenship in the Heart of Virginia. And Candace is talking about actually how African Americans in certain times in this country were not viewed as citizens because of their race, and how that view of citizenship changed with voting rights acts and different, the Sea Island citizenship schools, and how people of different races got voting rights at certain moments, and how they had to struggle for citizenship at particular times. And so in that way, nationalism was only open for certain races, right? And so that's kind of how she's describing it. This book is really wonderful. In your spare time, go ahead and read it. But she starts out from a moment of the free schools in Prince Edward County, and what's really wonderful, her grandmother grew up there, and so she got kind of this personal history of explaining what was happening at the time, but then she also does archival kind of analysis of what was happening. And she's tracing citizenship specifically connected to race. As it says here, Candace Epps Robertson tells an important story of African American perseverance and resourcefulness in the face of systemic white supremacy in the decade following the landmark Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, which is why it's Resisting Brown. But yeah, so we get those moments like that makes me think it's talking about America, but really kind of how the transnational is connected to citizens and nationalism.
We talked about that last week in Dr. Carter's class about citizenship, because we did Vieira's
American by paper.
Yeah, and I was trying to connect it to a previous thing we did, and I said if you want to look at just the ability to vote as a marker of citizenship, that kind of falls apart, because women couldn't vote till 1920.
Yeah.
But then if you expand that to in practice, can you exercise it? It becomes a much longer time frame.
Yeah.
And then if you take about, okay, well, if you're a citizen, if you have equal protection under the law, the current renewal of the Violence Against Women Act has not passed yet. Right. So there are markers. Once you put it down, it's an amendment or it's a law, so we fix the problem, and you kind of want to try to walk away from it. But in practice, it goes on for many decades after that.
Absolutely.
In almost every case I could think of.
Absolutely. And one of the things that Candace's work does, Amy Wan, you read this, if any of you are in Dr. Carter's class, I know you're reading Amy Wan's work. But one of the things you'll notice, I always tell my students, don't expect to get clear definitions from me, although I do have transnational right up here. But one of the things about composition and rhetoric, so that term citizenship, I could give you a definition, but the way you interpret it is also important, right? If we have on paper like a citizen is these things, if not everyone lives up to those things being like, yes, we'll treat you like a citizen, then we have to talk about, well, what are the ways that citizenship is being used kind of by people, either enforced or, de-emphasized by certain populations of people? How are some people relegated to not citizens in some ways? On paper, they might be citizens, but does that mean they're always treated as such? Yeah. Right? And so that term is important, but only in as much as like how it circulates and how it's used by by everyone, right? So like the papers are important for some situations, but that doesn't mean you're always treated like a citizen, right? Even if you can show documentation. So let's do one or two more. What other articles have we read that you can think about how they're transnational?
I wanted to talk about the Cushman article.
Yeah.
About the Cherokee Phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
And while that article obviously all was a situation all inside the United States, you had the interaction between the Cherokee Nation and the issues with the state of Georgia claiming lands that obviously the federal government weighed in against the Cherokee with. I was, as the role that the editor, Elias Boudinot, of that newspaper had to play, balancing the life of the paper against two sides, because you had the Cherokee, who were proud to see their alphabet on the one hand, but then you also had the white, I would say, literary sponsorship, who had a very specific set of criteria, like how a newspaper should look, how the language should be presented, that he had to negotiate if he wanted to keep the paper funded and up and running. So the tension that he had just to keep his operation going. And then I thought, the irony of him siding with removal of the Cherokee and then ultimately getting assassinated. It was kind of like, it was a tension that he walked along it so long it eventually snapped, and it took him with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad you brought up that one, because I think it especially, you've done a great job of showing how it shows this first part, right? How individuals build social field across real or perceived borders, like that idea of literally the removal of across nation states, but also this idea of, perceived with the Cherokee Nation of, okay, can you speak the proper, language? Can you put it into words? Can you do these things? And all the difficulties. One of the things I was looking up as you were talking is it made me think about how Vieira et al. Talk about kin work and effective ties, right? So kin work is actually described as kin work. So the conception, maintenance, and ritual celebration of cross-household kin ties, right? And then we have, so kin being relations and families. It made me think of how the Cherokee Nation kind of spoke about itself, and how Elias Boudinot talked about the nation as kind of this one collective, right? But then also this idea of effective ties. How would you describe, anyone in here, what would you describe as effective? Like affect, AFFECTIVE.
Shared emotions.
Yeah, shared emotions. Effective ties are like collectivity, solidarity, those moments of togetherness. And so Richard gives a good example of kind of this idea of a sponsor who's part of the Cherokee Nation but separate from, and we talked about that, right, with Andrea's presentation, this idea of like the complexity of sponsorship within that article, and how Elias Boudinot was perceived by some as being like a really good sponsor and others obviously not. But I think that all ties into this question of like effective ties and how people, how that solidarity is represented in those spaces. This is just kind of a little bit more of what comes from that article, Vieira et al. Is there any other article that you want to talk about? Does this make sense? Is it helpful to think about these articles and how they're related to transnationalism? Asawanues?
Yes, I don't want to butcher the name, but it's like the kinship or whatever of academia, and there's this, it's not perceived or real, it's ignored. Borders oftentimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Social fields.
So it doesn't fit into that part of it, but the rest of it, I mean, I see the ties and everything else and stuff like that.
Yeah.
There's a border, but it's one that we don't acknowledge.
Absolutely. And that way it might be just like perceived as
Yeah.
like, oh, it's not a border, right? We don't have to talk about language supremacy because there isn't any.
But when we
right.
challenge that, then I think that would.
Yeah, absolutely. So the goal with this isn't to see like, ooh, how do we fit everything that we've read into this definition? That's not the goal at all. But what I hope is becoming apparent is how this is both like literal transnational movement, but also this idea of perceived borders, real borders, and how it's really complex. And I love their definition because it gives us, again, an analytic to look at things. That doesn't mean every article that we read fits into this by any means, but I think it's a useful way to kind of think about these texts. I think when Andrew was talking last week, we started, I mentioned the word circulation, like how texts move, how they get passed to people. Quite literally, how did this text come into being? How is it circulated from me to you all? How will you all, maybe some of you teach it? That movement happens because people make it happen. And all of that is dependent upon certain circumstances. And that is often shaped by kind of like the movement. I guess what I want to say is the movement of text happens because people allow it to. And there's choices that are made. And I think that's what they want us to realize about transnationalism is it's not just something like, well, we have people from different countries in this room, therefore it's transnational, but actually the choices that impact how something becomes transnational, the reasons why people move, their forced movement, their forced dislocation, all of those kind of different levels of choice or something being forced on you. Jacqueline, did you have a hand earlier?
I was just thinking about the visa border labyrinth and how that would fit in with a transnational.
Yeah, absolutely. Say some more.
Oh. Well, just the fact that, you know, the crossing back and forth, the professor, how she goes back and forth, but also how the students come here, and also the students from Boston are kind of like drawn into this by helping to write those visa applications with the students from Colombia. And so it kind of blurs those lines.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad you brought that one up because later on I have an example from Tam Marco, and so I think your analysis will be really useful as we talk about her work. Go ahead and move on. Jennifer, if you're willing, do you want to give us just a little overview of what you did for this presentation?
Hi. I'm sorry that I wasn't available last week. I tried to make it. It didn't work out. So I don't know if you, let's see, I don't know if you can click through it or put it up.
Yep.
Somehow. Oh, okay, great. I can't. It's not really show. Oh, there it is. Okay. So I don't know. Oh, there it is. I have it on my screen too. So that's everybody. Good. Excellent. So I'd never used Padlet before, and one of the instructions said use something that you've not used before, and so that's what I did. It seemed to work pretty well. So I did some research, or I looked into Catherine Prendergast's Buying into English, Language and Investment in the New Capitalist World, and it discussed the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, or I guess the Czech Republic after they left communism, and how English became a sort of obsession for people in the Czech Republic, and that everyone really had to learn English to kind of keep their jobs, and yet as they tried to participate in the global economic market, they found that it really just was a larger version of communistic rules and bureaucratic regulations that kept them in a certain place, just to a larger degree and with a lot more subtlety that they didn't necessarily understand. And so I thought that was a really interesting conclusion to draw from that, you know, because we tend to think of globalism as maybe a good thing, at least economically, and so it was interesting to see that a lot of these countries, particularly Soviet bloc countries, don't really have the access that Western countries do to the global market. So as we go through the Padlet here,
Yeah, just tell me where you want me to go.
I'm sorry, I should be looking at you, but I'm not. And now I'm
That's okay.
oh, now I'm just having problems. Did I sign out? Okay, well, I can't actually see any of you anymore. So I'm not really sure what happened. I don't know if you can see me.
We can still see you.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So I'm not really sure where my video went, but off to the side where we have keywords and phrases. I don't actually know a lot about linguistics, so the term lingua franca was new to me, and so I went ahead and find that, which is a language that people with different native languages use almost universally, which I thought was kind of an interesting concept, especially in the U.S. where we primarily use English. So, then following down there along the left of the screen, I discussed a little bit about how Soviet bloc countries tend to be disrespected within the economics of Europe, and discussed a little bit about linguistic privilege. And I hooked up a video to it. You probably don't want to play it, but what was most interesting about that video was down in the description box, they wrote about how you're probably not going to be very good at speaking Czech, but they really appreciate it if you'll at least give it a try. Like, just a little bit of respect apparently goes a long way, which I kind of thought was interesting. So the video is not overly interesting on its own, but some of the descriptors and commentary kind of is. And then coming down on the right-hand side, where I talked a little bit about communism and capitalism. Following the Velvet Revolution, many of the bureaucrats who were in power during communism remained in power, leading citizens to question the extent of the governmental change. So, the Velvet Revolution is considered historically kind of the right way. I have a friend who is a history person, and he described it as like the right way to overthrow communism, because apparently it was, went pretty well and pretty smoothly. And so it's interesting though that from local people's perspective, they just saw the same people. So, the same thing, different day. And that was interesting to me as well. So under communism, speaking and studying English was revolutionary in and of itself, and access to English was really limited. So most students didn't even have access to native English speakers. And so when communism came to an end, people who could speak English were highly elevated until they stepped into the global marketplace and realized that they weren't English enough. They couldn't speak English well enough. And so, I put as a question, is it a revolutionary act to speak a language other than English in America? And I don't know about that. Then down at the bottom was just my personal observations. I don't do it as much now because I have a couple of groups of standard clients. But for the longest, when I freelanced, I'm a freelance writer. I do web copy. And for the longest, when I freelanced, I would pick up jobs on Upwork. It used to be called Elance. I'm sure a lot of you have used it before. And what you found was that all of the higher paying or longer term jobs all required a native English speaker. So it didn't matter, someone with a degree in English Lit as if they weren't native English speakers. And so you find that the most interesting example here is the one at the very bottom, which is clear. If you want to click on it, I can't see what y'all are doing. But if you
I can click on it.
Okay, great, good. It's written, you'll see that it's written by non-English speakers, but to apply for the job, it requires that you be a native English speaker or US only. So a lot of times, I think probably to be a little more politically correct, they will say US only or US UK only. And that is to limit people who are coming in without being able, or who are not native English speakers. So, all right. That's about what I've got. I'm gonna work on it and try to find where you guys are again, and hopefully pull that back up. And I'm gonna be really quiet because I also can't mute myself. So if you, unless you have questions, and then I'll answer questions, because like I said, I can't mute myself. So here I am.
Does anyone have questions for Jennifer or comments? I think Buying into English is, I will say really quickly, when I read Buying into English, I read it probably 5, 6, 7, 8, probably 8 years ago for the first time. And it just like blew my mind. And like this, I read Buying into English, Suresh Kanagaraja's Geopolitics of Academic English, Minzon Liu, and then some Transnational Feminism, which we'll read in a couple weeks, all like in a couple weeks. And I was like, how did I not know these things? What is the world? Like, who am I? What is the world? How is English like doing these horrible things, you know? I felt that. I mean, it was a really spectacular moment of, spectacular in both the best and worst ways of like, how can English be this divisive?
Right, and what was so interesting to me was how incredibly subtle it is, because when people from the Czech Republic joined, I don't know if they're in the EU now. I'm not sure. Anyway, but as they began to join the global marketplace, they realized that they're basically just workers, right? Like we really just are only interested in these really basic. I have my video back now. There's really only these really basic things that we're interested in getting from you as a citizen of the Czech Republic. And even though we've said capitalism is what we're doing and this is how it works, and you'll see in my paper there's a quote from someone who said, maybe we need to teach the West about capitalism because this is not how capitalism works. And so they came in expecting something very different, and what they found was a new set of restrictions that they could not understand, especially since, you know, they had bought in so wholly to the capitalistic American, you know, laissez-faire finances plans or economic plans. So now I'm going to mute myself.
Yeah, Jacqueline. Okay.
I found it interesting, Jennifer, that you also related it back to the Ford article, because when I read this one, it reminded me of the Ford article, how they were talking about how the employees learned English, but then they were never allowed to be promoted. So it didn't, you know, allow them for upward mobility. It, you know, in the sense of going after like supervisor or management positions, it always had to be a native speaker.
Right. I found that too. I thought that was really interesting. And actually, in looking through the other Making Connections presentations, Richards seemed to relate to that. And I meant to at some point come back, and I probably will still come back through and try to link to Richards on the Padlet as well, because he talks a little bit about that in his Making Connections article presentation thing.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, we can cut. Okay, so because I wanted to pull some ideas together today, one of the things we'll do, and then we'll take a little break, I wanted to read a couple responses from certain response papers. And the reason I'm pulling these out are because I think if I didn't pull one from your paper, it doesn't mean anything. It's literally just I pulled out a couple of the first ones I saw that I thought would be thought-provoking and provide discussion. But I want us to talk about these, okay? First thing I want to do is read them all through. And they're just little snippets, so we have to remember, like, these are taken a little bit out of context. But I want us to read them and kind of, hopefully, I don't read all of them, so hopefully people will volunteer. Read them, and then I'll describe what I want us to do, okay? And I wrote who wrote them at the beginning. So can someone start at the beginning of the first, full sentence?
I thought this statement was particularly useful. I'm trying to set up the problem of the conditions of white language supremacy, not just in our society and schools, but in our own minds, in our habits of mind, in our dispositions, our bodies, our habitus, in the discursive, bodily, and performative ways we use and judge language. I think a lot of folks try to excuse themselves from being part of the larger system without actually taking a look at their habits of mind. Even in the class videos, I hear everyone trying to comfort themselves and each other, identifying as one of the good ones. It's just not productive. My comfort as a white person is not productive. In fact, it's explicitly destructive.
Okay, so that's from Logan. This is from Abigail. Can someone read this?
Students need to learn to work on their writing within, on, among, and across a variety of Englishes and languages, not simply to reproduce and write within the conventions of a particular standardized version of English. I agree with this statement, but it's challenging to implement given the education system works on a standardized testing, and given the fight over standardized testing. It's been going on since testing began, and there still isn't any change. It's not currently possible to allow students to explore literacy and language in their own way and develop their own voices. To change this requires changing the education system.
Oh, this one's, oh, sorry, this is Logan again. Can you read the first one?
I know you said in the class video that there are no answers. I get that the problems are huge and systemic, given the deeply messed up history of our country and the profoundly broken ways our institutions function. I still think there are things we can do as individuals in our classrooms, even if those things are small in the scheme of things. I hope the discussion can get there. Thanks for all the illuminating readings.
Andrew, do you want to read your own?
Sure, unless somebody else wants to read it. So if you use a single standard to grade your students' languaging, you engage in racism. And upon my first reading of this article, I found myself uncomfortable and at odds with what Inouye was presenting. However, after reading through many of the other articles in this class, I began to understand that these statements aren't far off, as many non-white persons in the US have been affected by some form of white language supremacy.
Thank you. Tia, do you want to read yours or no?
Yes, I'll read it.
Okay.
When it comes to, oh, I can't see the other side of my, hold on, let me try to get it off. Yeah, I can see it. Okay, sorry. When it comes to language, literacies, and culture, there are many, but what all three of these articles presented was that what doesn't fit the majority is not accepted. It is seen as inferior, which then leads to a race of people being marginalized. This form of discrimination is being seen on university campuses, classrooms, corporations, and society, period. And each of these authors shed a light on the subject so that language, culture, and literacies should not be seen as one thing, but as a multitude of treasure.
Thank you. Can someone read Lubna's?
The articles for this week address the theme of how political systems have used and currently still are using language as a source of power to give and take away human rights.
And then could someone read Sherilyn's? Start at the top.
I can't see that far.
Okay.
I can read it.
Yeah, Andrew.
In the 9th grade, I went to a school that was majority Caucasian, and I quickly developed an understanding that my language had to match the scenery in an effort not be looked down upon or judged as inferior. Diversity and multiculturalism was not as prevalent in the mid-'80s as it is now. Like most teenagers, I conformed to not be othered. Most Americans have bought into the great American melting pot mytho-history, but the reality is one gains admittance into the pot based upon likenesses, and language is one of them. Missy Watson states that standardized English was historically, and continues to be, modeled after the speech of privileged white communities, and that it remains one of the many tools used to maintain social and racial hierarchies. Language controlled me as a teen, and apparently it still does, as I can too easily toggle between Englishes. But how do I teach my students the English by which they will be evaluated and judged by, yet discontinue using English as a tool of oppression, a weapon that subjugates? Watson believes that we must share with the people, all educators, and all students what we have come to know about the politics of standardized English. This sounds good in theory, but I don't see how that idea would work, and especially for a person of color. In my case, I think it would simply be seen as an attempt to legitimize substandard English and would be promptly dismissed if I were to be listened to at all.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I think that's it. So I wanted to bring up, as I said, it's kind of hard with online students and them not being able to be here to speak, but I know we interact online, but I wanted to read some of the discussions, and a couple of you, Andrew and Tia, if you want to. I don't want to force you to, but if you want to say more about them, you're more than welcome to. But you don't have to focus on these, but reading these, what kind of themes are coming up from these responses? And what you've seen online in discussions. What are the themes that you would say?
Well, those boundaries of transnationalism are apparent in just what we read here. Whether or not we should continue to enforce those borders, or whether we should cross those borders, or Logan made a really good point of do we comfort each other because we're doing what we're doing in our classrooms, or do we change, or I guess it's a good question, but how do we continue our lives when we're confronted with this idea that everything around us is being manipulated by something else that's not out of our control, but that's difficult to control?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that brings us to one of the big questions of the class is like what, and one of the things I hope I'm going to give a couple of answers to today. But I don't know how to dismantle white language supremacy. I will tell you flat out, I don't know how to. But one of the things I think we can in this class think about are what are the steps along the way that all of us collectively and individually can do in our classes to, if that's our goal, to try and do those things, right? I'm someone personally, and you don't have to agree with me, I'm someone personally who doesn't think it's often productive to just get rid of the system, because I think that kind of, if the system is white language supremacy, yes, I want to get rid of it, right? But I don't think you can just get rid of the educational system. I don't think that's a productive way of looking at things, because I don't think the educational system is just going to go away. I think there's pieces of it that we can kind of revolutionize, and I want to revolutionize the whole thing, but I don't know if it's productive to say today, if we want to take step one, well, it gets rid of the system, right? Because that takes us out of the constraints that we all have to make money, right? Takes us out. If anyone wants to fund all of us for jobs, then we can start thinking that. But I think it's useful to think within the constraints that we have and outside of. So both and. What is the revolutionary thought, and what's the, okay, if we can't do the revolutionary thought, how do we function within the system but change it in ways that benefit people. Yeah.
As the one in the class.
I know you want to blow up the system.
As
Tell
saying
us.
that,
Yeah.
as the one on camera and recorded having already said that.
Yeah.
The advocacy I have is it's not blowing up buildings. It's literally taking the syllabus for the semester and shredding it.
Yeah.
That I'm not saying we shouldn't have a formal education system, but I don't have any faith in incremental approaches because this is the same talk since at least the 80s.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
if there was any hope that incremental approaches would work, I would have seen it. For every isolated case of a progressive locality, because this is also, if we talk like from 12th grade down, this is also local based. For every progressive school district, there are 6 that teach to a test and can't get out of that. And that's funding and I understand the constraints within which, but I have no faith in the incremental approach.
So I'll push you on this one. I would actually say that shredding a syllabus is an incremental approach. That's just one piece. Shredding the syllabus doesn't change the system. It's a step.
If every syllabus on campus was similarly stretched.
Okay, yeah.
If history and lit and lang and math, math is math.
Then who? And this is just we're just teasing this out, right? If every syllabus on campus is shredded, who gets in the summer?
Preferably.
Okay.
So there's time to write.
Who gets to choose to rewrite them?
I would say the people that teach it, because, and Joyce, you correct me if I'm wrong on this, you teach. How much of a say do you have in your curriculum versus how much is handed to you?
Well, so that's kind of an approach, like as a department head in the high school, my 9th and 10th grade teachers are tested. So I require that they stick with their TEKS or TEKS system, and it tells you what you're supposed to teach every day of the year. My juniors and my seniors are not tested, so we move them towards a more college way of thinking.
But, okay, in this situation,
but I can do that.
Joyce is in our class. We like Joyce. She's great. We know she has best intention. Now, what happens if Joyce decides, sorry, I'm putting you on the spot, but other Joyce, we'll call you something else. What if this other Joyce in an alternate universe decides she wants to teach things that reinforce white language supremacy or enforce negative things?
And I'll take it back. We don't go the complete because we're still reading works of literature. We're still doing these things, but we're not following what they call the YAG, the year at a glance, where it's like you have to, for unit 1, it has to be poetry. Unit 2, it has to be dramatic reading. And I mean, we're still doing literature things,
right?
But we're shaking those things up more than is prescribed by TE. So I can't say throughout the year. That was bad.
But so what happens if we take, I like this like brainstorming though, if we take Brian's idea of shredding syllabus, how do we know that the teachers we employ are going to do the thing that's
it's difficult.
Is best?
Because a lot of the teachers don't, they like the structure, they like being handed that YAG, they don't have to think. It doesn't turn out well, but they don't, if you hand a teacher, some teachers, not necessarily all teachers, you hand them like some readings and you're like, here, develop a curriculum, and they're like, that's too much work. So there's also that aspect of it.
Yeah. What do people think? Haley.
Okay, so my first year teaching, I was taught after your interview when you're hired to ask for your curriculum. And I was handed my literature book and was all here it is. So every year I remake my curriculum to fit what I want to do and what my students need. So I make my own year at a glance based on the Texas.
High five. That was it.
I do that I teach English 1 through English 12 now. So I do that for all of my classes. I pretty much do what I want to do and then pray to God that my kids pass the test, because I could care less about a 5-hour test and whether it determines if they're smart or not. I know they're smart because they can do my work, and that does not go over well with some people.
Yeah. So let me pose what's really a Sal's question, though. Right? And so this is a Sal talking here. I'm trying to set up the problem, and I say this, and Sal says this best, right? He says that he's talking to us, all of us, specifically people who are white. So if you identify in this room as white, he's speaking to you, myself included, and he's saying, I know you're good people, but because you're good people, we have to think about this. And he says, I'm trying to set up the problem of the conditions of white language supremacy, not just in our society and schools, but in our own minds, in our habits of mind, in our dispositions, our bodies, our habitus, in the discursive, bodily, and performative ways we use and judge language. What happens is, even in best of intentions, if we do something wrong, if we do something that hurts a student, if we do something that reinforces white language supremacy, then what? Because I guarantee, myself included, I'm sure I have, in some way, inadvertently. The system is set up so we do it, no matter how good, well-intentioned we are. So how do you respond to that?
I say we can't grade anybody. You can't give a grade.
Can't grade anyone?
Because you don't know the background of each individual. Everybody's diverse, unique. You don't know, even just by looking at somebody, what their language background or, socioeconomic status might be. Therefore, how could you fairly grade across the board in a diverse room full of different people?
Yeah, so the grades are like a type of capital, right? That as a teacher we give out, if you're a teacher, that we establish like who earns that grade. So if we get rid of grading, all of a sudden there's not that currency. Right? That could be. What other ideas do you have?
Jacqueline.
Yeah, Jacqueline.
I understand these ideas, but at the same time, for example, I teach at the college level. And I'm always faced with, I'm preparing them for the next class. I'm preparing them for the workforce. I want them to be successful. I want them to go out and get good jobs and make good money. And I know that employers are going to judge them based on their writing skills and based on their mastery of the standardized English. And this is not just like within our classroom. You could be holding them back financially, which will then hold back their children. And this just becomes a vicious cycle, right? Because Guy was talking about that in his article, about how these students are afforded a substandard education. And it's a way of oppressing people. And we all know that they're going to be up against these other students, that speak that more, affluent form of English for those same jobs when they graduate. So how do we help them compete, but at the same time not fall into this trap? I mean, I'm really interested because
you set up a extremely difficult problem. Does anyone have an answer to it?
It's not a good answer, but I think it just goes back to constantly thinking about the genre of writing that they're doing, validating both for a purpose. Like I teach sophomores that they have a different English teacher for English 2, in which they're taught a very formula 5-paragraph essay for the STAR. And then I also have them for 13-1, for credit instructor, right? So they're having a really, really tough time navigating those two spaces because I'm asking them to write their literacy narrative, and we're having to go back and revisit this.
Yeah.
Because it's just still, they're not there. Yeah. So just validating that genre, I think.
I think there's a difference between specifically the talk of assessments, and I don't know necessarily you have to eliminate grading entirely, but what I get from this is judging language. For example, WA1, your literacy narrative, I had it pitched as it needed 4 things. It needed an introduction and conclusion, an introduction and analysis of at least one sponsor, and if it wasn't traditional reading and writing, you had to make that connection between literacy. That's all I graded. Not the way you told me what it was. that you told me it in the first place was all I looked for.
Okay.
So I was still able to assign grades, but it wasn't, I didn't take points off if there was
based on the way they
different language present or a more conversational tone, because you're allowed to use I, you're allowed to talk, you have to talk about yourself in a literacy narrative. You can't, the writer of this paper, right? I don't want to read that personally, and that would be judging language. I think in that case, saying you didn't write it the correct way, so it's somehow wrong. So if we could look, careful what I say, if we could look at it as more content over delivery, we might be able to get away from this language judging that we might all be guilty of having done.
Well, and I think on a broader level, right? So you're specifically talking about writing assignment 1 at Texas A&M-Commerce, right? That's one example. A broader context of this, I think, is Kana Garage's work, which we read a piece of it, but in his book, he talks, and I mentioned this last week, how scholars in Sri Lanka can't participate in the knowledge-making practices of westernized journals because they aren't even given like that chance to perform the language, because it's like, well, it doesn't have the right, standardized English. It doesn't have this. It doesn't have the genre conventions. It doesn't have the introduction, because hey, in Sri Lanka, they don't put their thesis at the introduction. The thesis usually comes at the end after you've read the whole thing, and then I'm telling you, this was the point I was making. It also happens in Poland. I had a paper, my student fought with me, and I learned so much, because he was like, no, I'm telling you, this is how we do it in Poland. We give it to you at the end, and we show you, here's what my paper was about. And the more research I did, a lot of countries, you don't give a thesis in the introduction paragraph. You don't say, here's what my paper is about, right? So I think this is on multiple levels. It's in our classrooms right now, but then it's also in the discipline as a whole. I would say even more, Jacqueline's referencing how it's happening, kind of like these questions of language are happening in workspaces, right? How is an employer going to interpret someone who speaks, maybe a non-standard dialect? I don't have one answer to this. I am going to discuss after the break. I'm going to describe how I have approached it in my own career, and you can critique me all you want. And I don't think it's perfect, but it's the ways that I've found to do it. And I think it's difficult, and it's so contextual. Each one of you will probably find different ways to do it and different challenges, right? I think Sherry Lynn, I think it's important to think about Sherry Lynn's ending, though, stating, this sounds good in theory, but I don't see how that idea would work, and especially for a person of color. In my case, I think it would simply be seen as an attempt to legitimize substandard English and would be promptly dismissed if I were to be listened at all. And I think that's really important. So one of the things about this class, and we're going to take a break, but just before the break, I want us to think about, I think Sherry Lynn's question starts getting us to what Ralph Cintrone's main premise is. He says in the preface, how does one create respect under conditions of little or no respect, right? So that question of, if someone's not going to validate or validate my language, how do I create the conditions for respect? How is it in my power? I'm not even saying that it is. Is it in my power? Do I have any agency? Not me, all of us, we. And how does that agency shape or get shifted based on who we are? I am a white female teacher right now. That is a different positionality than each one of you standing in front of this room, right? There's multiple kind of pieces that impact who I am in front of you all today, and how I personally create conditions of respect under little or no respect. And so I think everyone's going to have a different answer for this. So Angelstown, Ralph Cintrone, how does one create respect under conditions of little or no respect? First off, general perceptions of what you read of Angelstown.
Beautifully
That
written.
is interesting.
Interesting, beautifully written. What else?
So it reminded me a lot of Senator Cisneros' House on Main Street.
Okay.
Because she integrated the English and Spanish well in her writing.
Mm-hmm.
And he did that as well.
Okay.
I like how he was saying towards the end of the introduction, or maybe it was chapter 1, that he was using his ethnographic work in Angelstown to understand like his own place of origin at the border of South Texas.
I really
Other
enjoyed
perceptions
the like how I mentioned earlier, that translation for the chapter that I read. It's kind of nice to know that you're being given the opportunity as a potential non-native Spanish speaker to truly understand what was going on and to feel that connection with the individual who you're reading about. Because even for myself, like I speak Spanish, but I'm not 100% fluent. And so being able to get the little intricacies of what's being spoken about and some things that I may not have caught, even being a native Spanish speaker, like it was really beautiful, and it kind of moved me and brought some memories out that I've had long forgotten from when I was a kid, and some of the stories that have been told to me by my own grandparents or my father or mother. So it was nice to see that connection and be able to develop that relationship with not only the author, but the subject matter as well.
Personally, the way that I feel about Ralph Centrone's book is you give me a class and I can find a way to teach this book. Any class. Because I think it's beautiful, it's powerful. I think that you can teach it in a methods class, you can teach it in a storytelling class, you can teach it in cultural rhetorics, you can teach it in kind of place-based classes, you can teach it in race and identity. Like there's so many classes in composition and rhetoric that you could teach this book with. So I think it's really, if you have time, when you have time, spare time. If you liked the little bit you read, keep reading, because the whole book's like that. If you didn't like it, sorry.
I like this concept of pairing logos with ethos. Like it seemed kind of obvious if you were to say that it's all manufactured, it's all constructed, but this goes a step further and kind of addresses the how of it in a way that I've never encountered before. It's just one of those things. Like it's invented, you adopt it when you're in the front of the room teaching a class, you're performing in a way that you're not in other situations. But I've never seen anybody pair that with the other main rhetorical device.
You didn't even see my slide before, but the next thing we're going to talk about is ethos and how it's constructed in Angelstown. So right in the early pages, on page 2, he says, I'm always concerned with the densities of a text and how to open these to scrutiny. And certainly one of the most significant densities concerns the writer's ethos, which is typically understood as a person's moral character or disposition. And then what Alex brought up was on page 5. Again, not a plant. This was not planned. But Alex brought up how Centrone is talking about the book's ethos, but then he says, I believe, on page 5, I believe that much of the book's ethos is entangled with these demons. I was born of Puerto Rican parents and raised in South Texas. I was the son of a farm manager, a PhD horticulturalist who was pragmatic and a highly skilled technician. The workers on the farm were Mexican, and they called my father El Patron. To this day, I retain a mostly Puerto Rican accent when I speak Spanish, which means I kept myself apart from the Mexican-American Spanish around me. And now I do not speak Spanish as easily as I speak English. Here are clues of human distances that even now cause me discomfort. I bring this up because I think Ralph Centrone does this better than almost any scholar I can imagine. I think Carmen Kennard is probably the other model of people Carmen Kennard and Ralph Cintrone, they have a way of talking about their personal lives that's so personal, but everything in here is academic too. He's kind of teasing out where he's from, how he speaks, who his family is, and explaining why that adds to the ethos of the text, right? When I say I want response papers that talk about personal stuff, this is the model. This is like, I don't expect you to write like Ralph Cintrone, but this is really the model. He does it so well. He kind of integrates and weaves together the personal and the academic in ways that are just so beautiful. And he does that kind of throughout. So I wanted to have just kind of a little open discussion on what you take away from Cintrone's book. I'll give you kind of things that I'm thinking about, but you can stray from these. But what I think we can take away from Cintrone's book is, first of all, his writing style. Like, this is a really lovely model of how to do personal, ethnographic, academic research. His research methods, he does this really great analysis of methods, and he talks through, here's what ethnography is, here's who an ethnographer is, and here's how I did my ethnography, and here's who I interviewed and how I interviewed and the places I visited. Here, I have an artifact, a map. Let me tell you why this map is important. Let me tell you why this map of this city told by Angel is important. Like, and he talks you through each and every decision he makes, and those are what we would call in composition, those are methodological choices. He's very explicit with his methods. There's his content, right? The content is interesting of the research and the analysis. Even, you see the subtitle, Cheroways, Gang Life, and the Rhetorics of Everyday. Even thinking about, like, someone in rhetoric and composition can talk about gang life, and that be part of the content of their book. I think he stretches what knowledge making is and what kind of literacies we look at. He has a beautiful way of storytelling. He's really kind of teasing out what ethos is. And then what I really love is this idea of what counts as a text or artifact. Even if you didn't read the entire book, just by glancing at the chapters, he has mapping and texting, looking for Don Angel, a boy and his wall, the logic of violence, the logic of trust, gangs and their walls, blacktop. So even there, like, what he's counting as texts, or like he's talking about street gangs, he's talking about literal walls and metaphorical walls. He's talking about blacktop. He's talking about maps created from cities by the people in those cities. Those are kind of different texts or different artifacts that, if you were to look historically, those are not typical in composition and rhetoric. Like, people are, studying like a piece of literature, or they're studying a piece of writing, but not necessarily studying a city, a place, a wall. So feel free to stray from these, but that's kind of if you need ideas. So what do you take away from Cintrone's book? What are the pieces that stand out to you, and why? Yeah, Haley.
So the first thing that really stuck out to me is the writing style. I've seen ethnographies, and I've seen quantitative and I've seen qualitative writing, and those are two very different things in the academic world, and to combine them is very, very difficult. And he did it so seamlessly that it's like he almost invented a new genre of writing ethnographies. It's just this thing. I've worked so hard to, because I like both sides of the quantitative and qualitative, but to mix them with your personal life is so difficult. So that stuck out to me, because it's amazing how he just kind of like folded it in on each other, and he made it work.
Yeah. Do you have a particular moment that stands out to you, or just in general?
Just in general, it's it's one of those books that you pick up and you're like, okay, so this is just the book that the professor asked us to read, and then suddenly you're 20 pages in and you're not realizing that you're reading. Really, it's that weird. I don't want to put it down, even though it's like super educational. I don't know how to explain.
Mm-hmm. You don't have to like Ralph Centrone. You can you can also explain if you dislike something. But what are the takeaways from it, right? What do you take away as a reader?
It felt like watching a documentary almost. To the imagery, I could almost hear different kinds of music throughout what he was describing. Like you can hear the church, you can hear the card, the almost like, I don't know. It gave you the way that he writes engages the senses when you're not actually hearing anything or seeing anything, but almost a little Hemingway-ish. I don't know, just really to the point. I don't know.
Do you have do you have a moment that stood out to you?
I would say throughout the discussion of the man in church that wants to be there so badly, and they're kicking him out, which is a really a theme that kind of I've actually heard a song about that. I've seen people doing experiments in the past couple of years of pastors will dress like a homeless person and sit outside their own church building and see how his own congregation might react to that. So that theme really stood out to me. Just thinking about also like Dallas. My husband's from Houston and I'm from Dallas. So when he's talking about kind of the snobbery of the Dallas area, I never really understood it when my husband would talk about that, because he's from more of a like low income Houston neighborhood, so Dallas always like bothered him when we lived there. And now, I mean, that kind of made more sense when I was reading that too. So those moments, I don't know, to me.
Yeah. So if someone didn't read chapter 1, right? Because I just said read one chapter, but if you didn't read chapter 1, the moment that Jennifer's talking about is right at the beginning of chapter 1 on page 2, actually. And he says, I remember one Sunday, a very drunk man at some point during the service started walking on his knees from the back of the church. He was filled with catastrophe and perverse ritual. He chanted something, perhaps the rosary in Spanish, of course. Perhaps he beat his chest rhythmically. I do not recall now. He kept shuffling forward on his knees until he reached more or less the front third of the church. We were astonished. The men who wielded the baskets always so dutifully came finally to pick him up and remove him from the church. Our layers of propriety rustled back into place on the surface of our lives, and our vulnerability was once again clothed. The collection baskets and this man, who seemingly sought deliverance from brokenness through ritualized penance, are now juxtaposed in this text. They tell me something about the ethnographer. I have passed like a collection basket before the lives of others. During interviews and conversations, during incidental moments, others placed something inside me. This book is an emptying of the basket. What purpose will their donations serve? But the image of a basket as passive receptacle collecting reality is, of course, unbelievable. In contrast to the basket image, much of this chapter will describe me as somewhat like that muddy, distorted man making odd gestures, this book being one. Right? So there's this moment of him blending who he is as a researcher, as an ethnographer, to an image that he conjures for us, but that influenced how he understands this book. Again, I think this is a really wonderful model for if you're practicing this personal but academic tone. This is the model. Carmen Kennard does it too. Trying to think of other people we've read who are like really deeply personal, but then also extremely academic. Those are the two that stand out to me right now, but I'm sure there's more. What else stands out to you about this book? What do you take away from it?
One thing that I also enjoyed was how you can kind of use this, or well, the chapter again that I read, use that chapter to kind of understand how some people might perceive an individual who doesn't speak English as their first language and maybe perceive them as unintelligent or unable to properly handle themselves in the world. And it's interesting because one thing that I found was that as he's describing I can't remember what it was, the albures, the discourse, the kind of joking discourse between himself, or Don Angel, and somebody else, with like the sexual puns or the derogatory terms, but the amount of wit that's involved in order to come out with something really quickly and kind of defeat your opponent during that discourse really kind of shows that you can't judge somebody based off of how they might sound or how they might present themselves in a language that is not natural to their own. And then that kind of got me thinking about the previous articles that we've read about English only and trying to consolidate into a singular method or a type of English, and the things that we would lose, or the things that people would lose who don't have English as their first language, and the inability for them to be able to express themselves properly and show how truly intelligent they are and how beautiful they are as an individual. Just got me thinking about all those different things that we've kind of come across so far.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Andrew's talking about chapter 3. If anyone in here is interested in kind of language, and if you are a linguist, chapter 3 I think is the one for you, because it's really beautiful in how he's talking about language. I think, were you talking about page 72 where he says, here's the best way to explain an albur? Imagine a language game among English-speaking males in which ideally a conversation proceeded conventionally, but with certain words maintaining another level of sexual meaning. That moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's on page 72 if you're interested. But it's exactly as Andrew just described, and the intricacies of language and how oftentimes people get pitted as, maybe being lesser than or inferior for, maybe messing up something, but with a language. But this idea of like the intricacies and how if you're speaking multiple language, you're in a lot of ways you have more literacy skills than others. So Citrone's really kind of referencing that and the nuances of language there. What other chapters did people read? So we have chapter 3. Did anyone read a different chapter than the first one? First and third? 2? Can you tell us a little bit about chapter 2?
Just like you were talking about how he's telling you everything he's making and why. The fact that he said, I approached it as a linguist with social linguistics, and then I realized I had moved into community writing, ethnography, just that transparency. It's just being completely vulnerable.
Yeah. And what's the main thing he's doing in chapter 2?
I don't know. I just like where he was just saying where he had just his approach to the whole thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. I connected to that because my master's in linguistics and now my PhD is in talk rhetoric. So
yeah,
I kind of felt that. Just that whole movement.
He kind of in this weird way. So academically speaking, a lot of times people put their methodology chapter as chapter 2. It's like first is my intro, and then chapter 2, I'm going to tell you my methods. Here it is. Or at least that's kind of what people want you to do in your dissertation or something. And he does this really beautiful thing about mapping, and he's like, I'm going to give you a lay of the land. And it's a lay of the land of like an actual map, but it's also mapping out kind of the way he's talking about the book, right? In the same way that he mapped out his ethos and like, here's the way I'm going to talk about ethos. He kind of does that in chapter 2. And he's talking about a map of Angelstown. And if you didn't catch did someone read why it's called Angelstown? Depends on what chapter you read. It's a amalgamation of, well, 2 of the men that he interviewed. But it's outside of Chicago, and he's talking about a town that, because the men's name were Angel, that he's calling it Angels Town. Angels is like plural town. What else stands out to you about this book? Let's go, actually, maybe let's ask this. What would you say in the pieces that you've read of this, how does Ralph Centrone start to answer the question of how does one create respect under conditions of little or no respect? Like, how does his book answer that?
I think he starts by acknowledging his own, not just limitations, but the ways that he's kind of contributing to. The example that I'm thinking of is the workers on the farm. Like he said, like he would go and physically hide because there was a class distinction and he was ashamed of it. And so he's kind of acknowledging like, hey, I did these things and I don't agree with it anymore. And it helped perpetuate this divide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that question of ethos, that one of the main ways you create respect is like you have to have some kind of character. You have to show your ethos. This is especially in my kind of, I would say my specialty is, if there is such a thing as a specialty, but what I study the most, community writing, and that's the big thing, is like ethos. You can't work with the community if they don't respect you. Because if you're outside of that community, or if you are part of that community, there has to be some kind of ethos. There has to be some kind of disposition or character that they connect with. Level of trust, right? And he kind of shows us that trust or those moments of friction, right?
I can't find it specifically. We talked about closing a distance, and I think that's related to what you were running in high, is creating a distance. So I think if we were to borrow from Centrone here and use a metaphor for what he was talking about, that might be one that would work.
Mm-hmm.
So you could do what you can to minimize the distance between the people who don't have the respect and those that are keeping them from having respect. That makes any sense. Try to move those people closer together.
Yeah,
not necessarily
absolutely.
In a physical sense, but in some way where they could understand each other.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly what he's trying to do. No, go ahead.
In the question, you can also say that him having his position as a professor, he using his own agency creates the respect for Latinx people by publishing this and telling his story and telling the culture and the struggles that he had and his family had. And he had no respect when he walked in, but he grew, it ended up growing.
Right. Yeah, so I think that's one of the things that we can kind of take away more broadly about this, and I think Asawa Nue talks a little bit about it, and he says, right, I'll give you a very clear example. I cannot change that I'm white. Me personally, I cannot change that. But what are the ways that I can act and use my whiteness and use my privilege in some ways, or use other privileges that I have to highlight something that maybe isn't highlighted? How did Ralph Centrone, use his position, as you said, as a professor, to highlight people who hadn't been studied before and hadn't been looked at as having, oftentimes in academia, being able to make rhetorical acts and use literate skills and the choices they make, right? He's highlighting those literacies and using his privilege to do that, right? He says at the end, so I think page 232 is where he ends Blacktop, which is the conclusion. And he says, in making all these in all this making of generalities, there's much that remains hidden, even from my view. Hence, there is much that can erupt like a saving grace to expose as illusion whatever conclusions I have attempted to make. The ethnographic text, then, is the making of an order, a neat and clean, a gathering of generalities and particularities, of explanatory tropes, personal and professional styles, imagined audiences, borrowings from other texts, and so on. The perceived field site passes through these filters to become the field site of the text. The field site of the text is the one that the readers come to know, and its borders are not geographic landmarks, but instead paper in the imagination of a reader. Can we ask the ethnography to be more exact and more complete and more faithful to the field site? Other than demanding honesty and hard work of any field worker, I do not think that more can be asked. I realize that some perplexing, if tired, arguments regarding objectivity versus subjectivity are not being acknowledged here, but these distinctions no longer seem subtle enough to capture the experience of fieldwork. The sense I have, for instance, that fieldwork is largely ethos-driven, that logos gets made via ethos. And then he kind of concludes, here, of course, has been the guiding ethos of ethnography for most of its history, to move beyond the repetitive self toward a clarification of the field site, even if the clarity is one of temporary, illusory, or tenuous. This way of imagining ethnography as something that tries so hard to be exact and complete but remains always a failed expectation and a target for the sweetness of critique is very humbling. Yet it contains finally so very much that is worthwhile. And so it's interesting there, he kind of ends with this, in some ways, very abstract idea of ethnography, but everything he's told you is what you're just saying, of like these really nuanced and concrete moments of, as Andrew said in chapter 3, like talking through the nuances of like joking in a language, talking through like certain maps and places that these men are talking about, talking through, I always forget his name, Valero, A Boy in His Wall, chapter 4, Valerio. He's talking about these really like intimate moments and then explaining like, here's how we can change our whole understandings of what ethnography is based on these small insights that mean everything. And I think that's really like, it's really unique to see. He's kind of just saying like, hey, I gave you this whole ethnography, but here, you know, even when I'm saying ethnography is important, well, I gave you some conclusions, but really just keep going with it. Like, I think he's extremely humble in his writing, and I think that's what is exciting about it. Anything else? What else did you like about it, or dislike, or what stood out to you? I'll end on this then, with our discussion of Angelstown. I think on page 3, Cintron says, if we think of fieldwork as thick with representations and displays as anthropologists interested in performance often do, we might begin to sense how we might talk about the rhetoric of artifacts, rituals, cultural institutions, informants, texts, architecture, public and private spaces, silence, and so on. And I think one of the things he does really well in this is he uses methods of fieldwork, ethnography, interviews, those are all methods, and analysis of artifacts to analyze unique things that draw attention to marginalized communities who haven't really previously had. Cintron's book came out, I want to say the early 2000s, 97, right? This hadn't really been done. So he's kind of one of the first people in composition and rhetoric to do something like this. So it's also important to put it in that context of how he's reshaping methods for an entire field, you know, in 1997. When the field of composition and rhetoric probably didn't really emerge till the early 90s anyway. Anyone want to say anything else about Cintron? If we read the entire book next time?
Yeah.
All right, everyone read the entire book. No. I think you would have killed me if I told you to read 200 and some pages. But I think we got the main points. my goal with this book wasn't that you get all the content in it. It was really more the what I told you here about writing style, methods, like that is what your takeaway is for Citrone. All right, the last part of class, we only got 20 minutes. What I wanted to do is because of the discussions we've been having, and because I know that some people in their response papers have been asking for kind of want answers, like what can we do? I'm going to offer up some examples of how I view myself as an educator and how I believe people can take steps forward. By no means do you have to agree with me or do these things yourself, but I see a lot of people asking for answers like what can we do? So I'm giving you my interpretation of that, and then if we get to it, we're going to brainstorm, and if not, you'll be doing that for homework. Online people will be doing it for homework, but I'm just going to talk you through kind of these levels that I see happening and how we can approach things. So if the question is, how do we globalize composition, and what power or agency do you have, or what are your constraints? The ways that I believe we can globalize composition, it's kind of a multi-layered approach. So the first one I say is histories. This kind of goes to Brian's idea of shredding the syllabus. I think we need to approach like what histories are we teaching, what texts are we teaching, what texts do you teach in freshman English, and they need to include diverse histories in our classes. We need to be changing the text we use and the histories we tell. My question is, are your histories in your classrooms, in your communities? It's not just for teachers, but this is, in your lives, are the histories you tell representative, diverse, and inclusive? And diverse and inclusive for whom? I think we need to think about those things. If you're a teacher, if you're an educator, how do you bring students in to tell new histories in the classroom themselves? One of the ways I would say that we do that here, or we attempt to do that here, is actually through our writing assignment. So for instance, in writing assignment 2, we ask students, in writing assignment 1, we give them a literacy narrative and say, use your own literacies, whatever those are, code switch if you want. In the second one, we actually say, in what situations are you aware of how you're using language? What situations do you code mesh or combine multiple dialects or different languages, as Rashawn Young et al. Note? Code meshing has occurred throughout many of our readings. You can do a project that discusses how you use language in various settings, and you can do a project that actually enacts code meshing. So I would argue that one of my goals as a director of writing is I want students to bring in their own histories by actually enacting that language, by enacting that code meshing. In the field, right, so I want us to think about this class, 513, what are they called? Learning through composing in globalized world. It's not actually a teaching class. This isn't like, now go take this away for teaching. This is about a field of composition and rhetoric that often has implications for teaching, but we're looking at it on multiple levels. We're thinking about it as researchers, as scholars, as students, and as teachers. It's really multifaceted. So for the field, what I co-wrote an article a couple months ago, and I said something I thought I could read better than I could talk out toward the end. And really, so what I said here is, so what I think this work has taught me is the importance of mobilizing and organizing, as Vani, she's one of my co-authors, noted. I do archival work, so I said, no, I don't think an archive changes class structures or eradicates poverty. But I do think that this work has started a conversation that developed into an archive that can be mobilized into a teaching tool for instructors and community members to talk about the importance of class and show how this is a community writing group, self-organized working class writers, and they mobilize the network to speak back to the ways that institutional forces that diminish them. Teaching these histories, like the Fed, the group that I work with, is a necessary step in moving forward toward change. what I see this work doing is drawing attention to stories and then developing or discussing the need to create spaces for such work to develop in our community engagement histories. How we make our work public, so that means moving beyond the academy, and in our organizing efforts. First, I think of continued forms of revisionist historiography, of bringing in new voices, are crucial to a broader sense of how marginalized communities have built power and resistance. So I say I'm amazed at the important historiography work about community histories. The Sea Island Citizenship Schools, the Free School Association, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, Polish Immigrants of Ford English School, Third World Women's Alliance, Syrians for Truth and Justice. Let me get a show of hands. Other than Vincent Portillo's article, has anyone ever heard about the Sea Island Citizenship Schools, the Free School Association, or the Carlisle Indian Industrial Schools?
Yes, I have.
Tia, I'm guessing it's the citizenship schools, right?
Yes.
Because those are from South Carolina, where you were talking about.
Yeah.
But where did you learn about them?
I learned about it in school as early as, say, like middle school. It was a school that helped the African Americans of Gullah culture. It helped them to vote, to have voting rights.
Yeah. Right. So it's pretty clear that in a class with very intelligent people and very well-read people, only one person aside from myself has heard of these things, right? So that's part of my argument of we have to tell different histories, the very first step, right? For me, these histories are eye-opening and need to be taught, remembered, and circulated. But I want to take that one step further. So beyond teaching histories, I think we need to continue organizing and building where we are. Recently, my cultural rhetorics class, I talked about you guys, cultural rhetorics class read Tam Marco and Al's Proyecto Querido. This gut-wrenching, moving piece describes how maintenance workers at Emerson College, many of them immigrants who fled from war, violence, and poverty, collaborated with Emerson students in a bilingual class and risked being fired. Now, the realities are that the workers might get deported. My class was left with, what difference does academic publishing make if workers are getting deported? You can fill this in with too many examples of hate, violence, and tragedy. As a writing program administrator, I've had to think about how such conversations might be part of first-year writing courses, and I've been able to include community literacy within the curriculum to encourage programmatically the importance of telling stories and highlighting marginalized voices, and of acknowledging and respecting various types of literacies, knowledges, and abilities through the content we use in our classroom. So this goes back to the shredding of the syllabus, right? And Joyce saying, well, let's teach different things. So this has led me to think that organizing and building begins at many levels with curriculum choices, projects we choose, methods we use to make this work visible, and then how we involve communities and continue to value their knowledges. So I think that's how I think this idea of histories comes in as the first step. What histories do include in the classroom, but then how do we tell those histories to a field? And how do we tell that to beyond academia, a more public, a broader public. One of the things about our work so far is we've mostly read academic texts. Missy Watson's has been the only one written for a more public audience. Her piece was published in, I think, Inside Higher Ed, maybe. So other things that I thought about is like methods need to be reshaped. So in my mind, to globalize composition, to be more inclusive, to kind of challenge, supremacy in many ways, I think we need to reshape methods to include knowledges from marginalized perspectives. Ralph Cintrone does this better than I can, but to think about ethnography and oral histories and interviews. Ellen Cushman shows us how certain communities can be discussed if you bring in different methods. What methods allow you as a researcher, as a teacher, and your students to represent composition in unique ways? So I have some examples here. I won't go through them all. Oh, maybe I don't know what this is. building projects. Oh, that's the wrong link. But I have links to work that I've done that's more public. This is kind of a community archive of working class writing that I developed. There's actually, for instance, I'll show you an example. They're transnational and translingual texts. This one is writing by Asian women, called Breaking the Silence, and it's about life of Asian women who migrated to London. There's also things like Florence Agba. She is a woman from Ghana who talks about not knowing how to speak English or read and write in any language. She was illiterate in the classical sense of literacy until she was in her 40s, and this is the first book that she ever wrote talking about how she gained literacies in different ways. And so even like thinking about literacy in a new way and bringing it up Florence's story, using methods like I actually interviewed Florence so I can talk about her story and use her language and then showcase her book. So rethinking like the actual methods we use, right? The other ways I see us being able to take steps is building institutional structures. So some of you are teachers, so think about curriculum changes. It won't let me link here, but I have how at Texas A&M-Commerce I've integrated bilingual texts into the curriculum. I've also taught study abroad courses where thinking about global identities and how these are students who I brought from different universities to London, and they worked with archivists and community activists and historians. So taking them to a different location, right? The other one that we started talking about earlier is expanding disciplinary journals or publishing. One of the things that I've been part of with Steve Parks is a publishing company, Parlor Press, but a series specifically called Writing and Working for Change. And as you see in our mission statement, Writing and Working for Change was designed to recognize the collective work of teachers of English, writing, composition, and rhetoric to work within and across diverse identities to ensure the field recognizes and respect language, educational, political, and social rights of all teachers, community members, and students. While initially focused on special interest groups, the series now includes text written by individuals in partnership with other communities struggling for social recognition and justice. The reason that Steve Parks and I started this was because it wasn't there. We didn't see someone who could publish a book about social justice in composition and rhetoric. So luckily, Steve had the capital, the social capital and the cachet to be able to do this, and I tagged along for a ride. But we actually published Elaine Richardson's book. We published This Is the Weight of Our Armor, a group of veteran writers. We published Liliana Velasquez, Dreams and Nightmares. She's a 14-year-old Guatemalan refugee, and we actually teach that books here. We published a book called Becoming International, Musings of Studying Abroad in America. And then we republished other people's English, Code Meshing, Code Switching, and African American Literacy. Vershawn Young came to us because the publisher who initially published it, they said they weren't going to do any more print runs of it. And so there was no one else who would kind of continue the publishing. Well, if a publisher stops producing it, no one can read it, right? And so he came to us and we republished it through our series. So the only way that this exists, one, is because Steve had kind of the cachet. He's been along in the field a lot longer than I have. Two, we had people who were supportive. Three, like it came up because there wasn't a structure for those types of books. People couldn't really publish like community, social justice stuff yet. And then I think also sharing resources and joining groups. So for instance, transnational writing, there's a composition group, and they have a lot of, like, they have a Facebook group, a SIG, which is a special interest group. And then from that, you can kind of see other groups as well. But here, I'm kind of posing the question to you all, you know, how do you find ways to enact the theories that we're talking about that you want to portray? I don't expect you all to do these things. And I'm not even saying like, oh, Jess did these, so they're a great model. I'm not saying that. These are the little moments, though, along my career that I've been able to start, and the ways that I'm hoping to get to that question of how do we do these? How do we enact these changes we want to make? These are all just examples of ways that I think I talked about histories, methods, building new projects, and institutional structures, and those are largely for teachers and people in academia. But these projects also move beyond the classroom. So we have things like, I'll have to fix the link on this, but this is Proyecto Querido. So I mentioned from Jacqueline earlier. This is where Tam Marco and her students and the janitorial staff workers actually drove their vans across the country, and they had, the vans had all their writings on them. And so it was kind of a movement of physically dislocating from Boston and driving to the border to advocate, but also like you're moving beyond that classroom. This one is Stephen Alvarez. He taught this college taco course, is hands down the best class of 2018. Stephen Alvarez taught a course called Taco Literacy, Public Advocacy in Mexican Food in the U.S. South. And so it was a class that began in the University of Kentucky, but then it kind of has created a new audience for it. People are talking about taco literacies who have no clue like what literacy in the way that we're studying it is, but they talk about taco literacies. Like, you can follow the hashtag, and it's really amazing to see how it's extended in the real world beyond kind of academia. Jim Rodolfo, he did a project with the Samaritan community, and he did a digital archive of their works, but he also, so he was digitizing Samaritan text, but he also created a Samaritan keyboard. So like Ellen Cushman was talking about, and you were talking about with the, what language were you talking about? Sequoian, right? Like just being able to text in different languages. He created one for Samaritan. Digital Blacklit and Composition. This is a group that is talking about identity in the university and how digital network of Black grad students in the U.S. And Digital Media and Composition Institute, thinking about people who identify as Black and how they can represent important literacies in digital spaces. This one is Syrians for Truth and Justice, started by Steve Parks and others, but it's human rights journalism and testimony. And then these are, I'm really proud to say my project was featured on here, but these are projects that were featured about prison reform, and then African American literacies in the Shenandoah Valley. So all of these projects live beyond the classroom, right? They might have emerged from scholars, but they take up our call for this class and thinking about how global literacies or transnational literacies extend beyond the classroom. So what I want you to do for homework, since we're running out of time, I want you to actually come up with answers, all right? This is your time, and it can be small. I gave you a range of projects. I gave you histories, I gave you methods, I gave you projects, and then I gave you fully fledged, like funded, years-long publishing efforts. But what can you do to enact transnational or globalized views of composition in the way that you want? I don't know how you want to do it. In your classroom, in your school, in your research, in your graduate work, or in your community. You can answer any or all, but I want you to come up with like a concrete example or multiple. Okay, what are the ways that you can enact these things. If it's changing a writing assignment, then tell me what writing assignment you'll change. If it's doing a graduate paper on something and you're creating a new keyboard, then tell me that. Okay, and try really hard, I'm not going to grade this, but try really hard to come up with actionable and tangible items. Like, what are those steps that you can take? If it's only writing assignments, that's fine. Start with wherever you're at. I realize that you all don't have, everyone's going to have a different level of power and agency, and everyone's going to have different levels of constraints for this. So answer with whatever you have. Okay? I'll post this so you'll have all the questions, but go ahead and post it by the end of class, or by the beginning of class next time. And then the last thing is for online students, you're posing a discussion question, commenting on 3 people's final projects, and then everyone in here and online also go in and comment on at least 3 people's final project ideas. Okay? We are exactly at 10 o'clock. So goodbye. Have a good night and good weekend.
Good night. Thanks for class.